The most recent all-encompassing successful survey of transgender individuals in America was completed in 2015. They were slated to complete another 5 years later, in 2020, but the political climate and pandemic in tandem prevented their success. As such, a large portion of these larger national statistics will be sourced from 2015. It is important to note that all statistics involving transgender individuals will always be skewed low, due in part to the percentage of transgender folks who are not openly out of the closet, and in part to underreporting, due to fear of harassment, discrimination, violence, or lack of action. In a study of the proportion of adults to self-identify as transgender in various national surveys, we see a rising trend. In 2007, 0.0023% of respondents self-identified as transgender. In 2009, 0.0024%. In 2012, 0.0025%. 2014, 0.0037%. 2015, 0.0045%, and in 2016, 0.0179%. In 2007, 1.4 million adults identified as transgender. 0.8% of the adult population in Hawaii, California, Georgia, and New Mexico identify as trans. 0.3% of the adult population in North Dakota, Iowa, Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota identify as trans. 0.7% of adults ages 18 to 24 identify as trans. 0.5% of adults ages 65 and up identify as trans. 0.6% of U.S. adults identify as transgender, double the 1.4 million figure from a decade ago. Sample transgender population sizes, estimated from completed surveys where a transgender identity was an option to select, show a steady increase. However, most researchers agree that this is very unlikely to be due to such a stark increase in the population itself, but rather people feeling both safer and freer to self-identify as transgender. In a set of studies in 2013 and 2015, Minnesota College reports that twice as many respondents self-identified as genderqueer or other non-binary identities than those who identified as transgender. Those indicating that they identify as androgynous or another gender altogether summed up to roughly half of those who self-identified as transgender. Several surveys in the past have listed transgender under sexual preference, leading to a number skewed even lower. Transgenderism is not a sexual preference or identity, but rather the feeling or knowledge that one's gender assigned at birth does not reflect who they are. Trans people are 4 times more likely to live in poverty, and for trans people of color, these rates are even higher. Around 29% of trans adults live in poverty, as well as 39% of Black trans adults, 48% of Latinx trans adults, and 35% of Alaska Native, Asian, Native Americans, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander trans adults. 22% of trans people have no health insurance. 29% have been refused health care due to their identity. 6 to 7 years ago, only 25% of the U.S. population supported trans rights. By 2019, support increased to 62%. Despite this, trans individuals suffer from a century-long stigma revolving around their supposed mental health status and predatory nature. Only 30% of women's shelters will house trans women. 22% of transgender people who have interacted with police reported harassment by police, with much higher rates reported by people of color. Almost half of the respondents, 46%, reported being uncomfortable seeking police assistance. 27% of trans people have been fired, not hired, or denied promotions due to their trans identity. trans people experience unemployment at twice the rate of the general population, with rates for people of color up to 4 times the national unemployment rate. 49% of trans adults said they were unable to vote due to fear of discrimination or harassment at polls. 53% of transgender people report being harassed or disrespected in a place of public accommodation, for example, a bathroom. 90% of trans people report experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. 54% of trans people have experienced some form of intimate partner violence. 47% have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime. 1 in 10 trans people were physically assaulted between 2014 to 2015. 44 transgender people were murdered in 2020 alone, one of the highest years on record. 41% of respondents reported attempting suicide, compared to 1.6% of the general population. Don't assume gender based on looks. Some transgender people pass. That is to say, by sight, you may assume that they are cisgender. However, not everyone is fortunate enough to pass as well as they'd like to, are only partially through their transition, or don't desire to transition at all. Don't assume a trans person's sexual orientation. One's gender and self-expression has very little to do with who they are sexually or romantically attracted to. A trans person can have any of the sexual identities that a cisgender person may have. There's a difference between being out in terms of sexuality and gender. In the LGB community, there is a great weight placed on the concept of being out of the closet. That is to say, these individuals do not feel the need to hide who they are, and they feel comfortable expressing that to the world at large. However, when a binary trans individual completes their transition, they are living their truth as participating and appearing as the gender most closely aligned with their internal workings. Being out as transgender is therefore an extremely personal choice, dictated by safety and comfort of present company. Outing. It is the goal of many transgender individuals to pass as their desired gender. Outing them may place them in unsafe situations and cause them to be seen as less than others of their same gender. Outing a trans person may result in them losing their job or housing, harassment, and even violence. Backhanded compliments. Examples of statements that may feel like a compliment when you give them, but will rarely be received as such. 1. She's too pretty to be trans. 2. You look just like a real guy. 3. If a trans person was hot enough, I'd date them. 4. You'd pass better if you wore a wig. Be patient with exploration. Someone questioning their gender identity may take some trial, error, and time to ascertain which, if any, they may like to stick with. They may still change their mind at a later point in time and ask you to use different pronouns. Do not treat this as a chore or speak to how weary this change makes you feel. Their journey is ultimately about only them, not you or anyone else. You may choose to be respectful and supportive, or give them space until you can learn how to be. Respect chosen terminology and pronouns. Many different trans people self-identify with various terms, each with their own set of nuances and implications. Don't assume what terminology someone wants to be referred to as. Don't assume that someone else with a visibly similar gender expression uses the same terminology. Quickly correct yourself when you make a mistake and move on in the conversation. Don't flounder and transfer your guilt onto your trans friend. Never ask a trans person what their real name is. Using this name is something we refer to as dead naming, and is a legal form of discrimination. Whatever name someone would like to be referred to as is the only name you need to know. Never ask about a trans person's genitals or surgical status. It is never appropriate to ask strangers about their genitalia. Trans people are certainly no different. Understand that insisting you know someone's gender assigned at birth is the same as insisting they tell you what genitals they have.